Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
As Betsy conveyed, we've done a lot about transparency in terms of resolution planning. It's all out there on the website. What we want to think about and what we're starting to work on now is how to improve transparency about our execution plans for Title II resolution. We've been working on these for 10 years now, and we should probably be starting to say more things publicly. So what do we want to think about today is what should we be transparent about now that would help improve confidence in the event that we're called to use our Title II authorities. And we've been thinking about this across, many dimensions. First, we look at who we need to be transparent for.
And what should we be transparent about now? We're talking about bankers and our government and the FDIC, as you just heard from that clip. Title of today's podcast, by the way, welcome to Worldview Matters. Our guest is Britt Gillette. We'll get to him in a minute, but the title for today, Central Bankers and Governments Are Lying About the Coming Financial Crisis. And of course, they're lying about the stability of the banking system. So Britt exposed some amazing information that I thought was eye-opening. We're going to talk about that. But first, I want to mention next week, I'll be speaking in Oshkosh, Wisconsin at Calvary Sunrise Church at 6:30 p.m. That's April 11. So 6:30 p.m. We'll do a Q&A after I'm done speaking, and I'll have my latest book there, of course, defending the biblical worldview and responding to the attacks on the Word of God, on Christians, on the church. So that's next Thursday, April 11, in Oshkosh. There's a Facebook invite. You can look that up, and there will probably be some flyers flying around the internet. So want to introduce Britt Gillette. You can go to the website endtimesbibleprophecy.com. He's also got a Substack that he's going to share when I bring him on, but also at his Amazon page, there's a box set of books, the End Times Bible Prophecy box set. Great, a lot of great books. And I want to direct you to his YouTube channel, and that is ETBP, End Times Bible Prophecy with Britt Gillette. He's a writer, and my goodness, he's been busy. And he's also an apologist. He writes a lot of books, inspirational books and Christian nonfiction with emphasis on Bible prophecy. Britt Gillette, welcome to Worldview Matters, brother.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. Now, mention that Substack before we get going.
Yes, it's just brittgillette.substack.com.
Okay, brand new, brittgillette.substack.com. Okay, so we opened with a clip that I stole from one of your videos. Okay, I borrowed it. Christians don't steal. But you just did a fascinating expose called Theyre Lying to You, Be Prepared. Tell us about the clip we just saw, and just let's walk through this.
Sure. So the clip that you just showed was from an FDIC meeting from November 2022. You could call it more of like a war game exercise of how do the various government agencies coordinate with each other in the event of a banking crisis, and especially if you had a major bank go under, similar to what we saw in the great financial crisis when we had Lehman Brothers collapse and we had the contagion effect that took place from that. So the clip you saw was this one participant, and she was saying, well, we need to figure out who we need to be transparent to and when we need to be transparent to them, which of course is, sort of defeats the purpose of transparency. It's not really the definition of transparency.
So it's interesting. They said this. They're right out in the open. They're saying this. Do they think that people just aren't paying attention? Do they think most people won't watch this and think anything? But just to ask the question, what should we be transparent about now? Meaning there's something that maybe they should wait to tell the American people? Or can you explain that? Because it's just astounding to me.
Yeah, well, I think this was in preparation for when the next crisis hit. So again, this was November 2022. We had a banking crisis emerge in March of 2023. So we had Silicon Valley Bank go under, we had Signature Bank, we had First Republic Bank. Those were the second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in U.S. history, even accounting for inflation. So the collective assets of those banks exceeded all the bank failures in 2008, to put that in perspective. And so they're talking about, well, what do we have to be transparent about? Because they don't want to panic the public and have the crisis go completely out of control. And so in 2023, when we had these, again, second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in U.S. history, Janet Yellen, U.S. Treasury Secretary, she went before Congress and said, the banking system is sound. Mm-hmm. Then about a month and a half ago, she went back before Congress in testimony and she said, oh, I remember those days very well. I'll never forget. We almost had a run on the banks and it would have spilled over into the global economy, right? So they're lying to us for a number of reasons, but one of which is they don't want to make the situation worse and they don't want to have a run on banks, because if people really understood how the banking system works, well, we'd probably all go withdraw all of our cash today. And I say that as someone who has cash in the bank. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind, we all have this idea in our minds that the banking system works the way it's supposed to work, the way we saw in It's a Wonderful Life, that we all go deposit cash in the bank and then it gets lent out to our neighbors so that they can buy homes and then they pay that back over time. But in reality, and this is on the Federal Reserve's website, during the pandemic, reserve requirements for banks were lowered to 0%, meaning they don't need to have reserves on hand. Most people think, well, they've got 10% of the cash deposits sitting on hand in case people come to make withdrawals. No, they do not. Wow. And so it's really a fragile banking system. And when you look at particularly what's happened in the last 2 years, when the Federal Reserve started hiking rates, what that did was when you have interest rates go up, bond prices go down, and the banks are sitting on massive amounts of government bonds, government debt that they bought at low interest rates, as well as mortgages that were taken out at 3%. And now those are worth less than they were 2 years ago. And so the banking system in the United States alone is sitting on over $500 billion in unrealized losses. Now, those are just paper losses until people decide that they're going to go get cash out of the bank, which is what happened at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank and First Republic. And once that happens, they have to sell those bonds at a loss. They have to sell those mortgages at a loss. And the cash just isn't there.
So are we talking about something similar to what happened in, what was it, 2008, 2009? Remember all the fiasco with Dodd Frank and everything? Is it worse? Are we going to see that again? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny that clip you showed when she mentions Title II, that's actually a reference to Dodd Frank, which was passed after the great financial crisis, because everybody got up in arms over the big bailout of the banks and the financial institutions. Yeah. They said, this is wrong. Taxpayers shouldn't have to bail this out. Make sure this never happens again. And so they said, okay, well, we're going to make sure that the banks and their creditors, they pay the price for future bank failures. So instead of bailouts, it's written into the law that there's something called bail-ins. And you might say, well, it's a bail-in. Well, a bail-in means exactly that. So if you have above the FDIC limit in a bank, that's $250,000 as of today, then let's say you have $1 million in there and the bank fails. Well, $750,000 of that $1 million goes to bail in the bank. And you get a little piece of paper that says you have a partial ownership in that bank, but it's a bankrupt, worthless bank. That little piece of paper is going to be worth a whole lot less than the $750,000 you had. Now, many people listening might say, well, I'm going to have $1 million in the bank. Correct. But if you have a job or you know someone who does, their employer might have $1 million in the bank to make payroll. And if the the bank fails and they can't do that, that has a widespread effect on more than just that bank, but the economy as a whole. And that's what we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. And they basically threw out all these rules and said, we're going to insure everyone in the bank. And at the time, Senator Lankford in Oklahoma said, well, what if there's a regional bank in Oklahoma that fails? Are you going to bail them out? And Janet Yellen's response was, well, we'll see. And so what that really means is we're going to get together and we're going to figure out who's politically connected at the bank, right, that needs to be bailed out. What are the greater effects? Is this going to cause some sort of contagion toward other banks? And if not, then that bank will be allowed to fail and then have to be bailed in.
Bailed in, ladies and gentlemen. We're learning new terminology today. Thank you, Britt Gillette. But I want to go back for those of us who are very simple, like myself. What, again, does FDIC stand for? Is that some sort of insurance? What does that even mean?
Sure. It's called Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So this was established in the aftermath of the Great Depression in order to give people peace of mind in putting cash into banks, because you had widespread bank failures during the Depression and people lost everything that they had in those banks. So we had this FDIC limit and it's insured up to that amount. Keep in mind, the amount they have is a fraction. It's maybe 2.5% to 3% of all the cash deposits in the United States. So if we had massive failures, FDIC insurance isn't there to cover that. They'd simply have to print the cash. And I'm confident they would do that. I'm not trying to scare anybody and say if you have less than $250,000, you have to worry about that. But you might have to worry about the purchasing power of those dollars because they'd simply print the dollars. No politician would allow widespread people to lose their cash deposits. But another thing to keep in mind is that under Dodd Frank, the FDIC has 3 to 5 years to settle the accounts from the failed bank, which includes providing FDIC insurance coverage. Now, again, I'm not saying that that would happen. Typically in the past when these things have happened, it hasn't been a long time. It's sometimes, the following Monday, you have access to whatever cash you had in that bank.
Wow.
But what I'm saying is the law says it can be as long as 3 to 5 years. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go in to this time where I think we're actually headed back toward this crisis, because a lot of the measures that were taken in the aftermath of the banking crisis last year, or in the midst of the banking crisis last year, they've come to an end. So one of those was this program called the Bank Term Funding Program that lent cash to troubled banks. And that was tapped to the tune of over $150 billion by troubled banks. Well, that has to start being paid back now. That program ended March 11th. By April 4th, $79 billion of that plus interest is due back from those troubled banks. And interest rates are actually slightly higher now than they were a year ago. So all of those mortgages and bond holdings that were unrealized losses are worse now. So we're heading into a potential situation where we're going to see maybe some cascading bank failures, and they've told us what they're going to do in the event of all of this.
And they're lying, as you pointed out in one of your recent videos. They are, in order to kind of prep us, because how did you put it? You said where a couple years ago, officials revealed exactly what they plan to do in the next financial crisis. And then you said, hint, hint, they plan to lie to us. So we've got a lot more coming up with Britt Gillette. We'll be right back on Worldview Matters.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily, world news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
Friends, if you're listening to our show via audio podcast, please help us out by leaving a 5-star review. It helps the show rise in the rankings. And if you're interested in sponsoring Worldview Matters, send us an email. worldviewmatters@fpeusa.org. Send us an email. Our producer will get right back to you. So Britt Gillette, look up his Amazon page and get any of his books, guys. He's got, like I said, he's got a box set. And you don't want to go without, if you're not already connected, and subscribe to his YouTube channel, ETBP with Britt Gillette. Look that up, and you can watch these. By the way, Britt, how many of these do you put out weekly? Don't you do several?
Yes, typically Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Okay. So how do you find the time to research all this and then do the videos, then start preparing for the next ones?
Well, it's a lot of hard work and a very understanding wife.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, really. By the way, you're in Virginia. You've lived there all your life, which is I find that to be very rare, but what a blessing that must be. You probably have a great community, Christian community around you and support there. Just tell us a little bit about your background growing up there.
Well, let's see. For those who are familiar with the area, I was born in Portsmouth and grew up in Chesapeake, Virginia. Then I went to James Madison University, which is more in the western part of the state. And now we're in Smithfield, Virginia, which is home of Smithfield Foods. Many people have probably heard of that and the Smithfield food products.
So this might be a question that might seem to be out of left field, but I think when I think future, when I think what's happening in our world, and your perspective is writing from a prophetic angle, the mark of the beast. We always see in Revelation 13, they've been talking about that. We've been reading about that for so long, and we've heard sermons on it. We've heard warnings. We've heard, but now we're seeing interesting signs that we're getting close. We're really getting close to that. How does that, or whether it's the mark of the beast, cashless, how does any of this relate to banking and prophecy?
Well, I think it's extremely relevant to what we just talked about. So for instance, many people have pointed out when the mark of the beast comes at the midpoint of the tribulation, it's not just going to appear out of nowhere. The Antichrist, the false prophet aren't going to decide, well, we need to figure out a way to do this. What they're going to do is flip a switch on something that already exists. So the groundwork, the foundation for that system is being built right now. We see this in central bank digital currencies and the tokenization of assets in countries all over the world. They're testing this right now. 98% of the countries in the world are in the process of either exploring this or testing this, running pilot programs, or they've actually launched central bank digital currency. Now, when we talk about that, that is not the mark of the beast. However, it is indistinguishable in function from the mark of the beast, and that you could program this currency in such a way that you could turn it off to whoever you wanted, a specific individual. So for instance, if you made a social media post that the government didn't like, they could say, well, you can't spend any cash outside of 1 mile of your home, and they effectively put you under house arrest.
Jeez.
So there's all sorts of things they could do to manipulate that currency. And how it ties into what we just talked about is, I believe there is a major financial crisis coming. This isn't just a problem with banks in the United States. It's a global issue. And when this finally erupts, it's going to cause a large-scale catastrophe similar to the Great Depression, much more severe than what we saw in the Great Financial Crisis, 2008, 2009. And I believe that they're going to roll out, as a result of that, these central bank digital currencies. And they're going to say, well, this is the solution because we need 21st century bank regulation in a 21st century world. So what we saw last year was they said, well, these bank runs, people are making bank runs on their phones. And so we need to catch up with the times, and this would give us insight. They'll actually use the surveillance capability of central bank digital currencies as a selling point. As for instance, I've pointed out back in the Great Financial Crisis, everybody remembers Bernie Madoff ran this Ponzi scheme that ruined people's lives.
Yeah.
with central bank digital currency, regulators would have known, oh, people sent their currency to Bernie Madoff, but he didn't buy any investments with them. He bought a yacht and he bought a home in Paris, and all of these different things. And so they would know that that's what he was doing, that it was a fraud, and so that's a selling point that they'll use for this. But I believe they'll roll this out as an example of the lying they're doing. Earlier this month, Jerome Powell went before the Senate Banking Committee, and he was asked specifically about central bank digital currency, and he said, "We're not even thinking about it," which is an outright lie, because Joe Biden issued an executive order in the spring of 2022 commanding them to think about it and saying, I want you to develop plans for this. The New York Federal Reserve System in November 2022 rolled out a program for wholesale CBDC among banks, for banks to make transactions among each other. Earlier this week, they announced the SWIFT system has been successfully running tests of central bank digital currency. And that's basically the system that the United States oversees for trading among the world's largest banks. It's like 11,000 financial institutions in the world are connected to the SWIFT system. If you remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was one of the first sanctions, is you're cut off from the SWIFT system. Therefore, you're effectively cut off from the global financial system. So they're already implementing central bank digital currency into that. So it's just an outright lie to say that they aren't even thinking about it. They're planning it, and they plan to roll it out. They just need the crisis to be able to do that, and that crisis is coming.
It is, and it's fascinating that you think about these video clips in your video that you did and what we just started the show. They're trying to decide, what should we be transparent about now? I mean, and then let's back up for a minute, Britt. God's in control. He's sovereign. We are reminded to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. All these things will be added to us. We're reminded that my God supplies all that we need according to his riches and glory. He is our provider, not the earth's economy. And yet we do need money to use here while we're on this earth temporarily. And it's getting closer. But I wanted to ask you, any insight about what happened during COVID and how they made some advances on where they could, hey, we can get control here, or we can make them do this, or rely on, us here. So any insights when it comes to the banks and when it comes to digital currencies that you can tell us that maybe what happened during COVID?
Well, I think it showed how much of the population will simply go along with what they're told to do.
Yeah.
And, you look at a number of things happened then. At that time, they had a shortage of change. You remember that? And they started saying, well, we can't even take cash at the grocery store because we don't have change. People just went along with a lot of these different edicts that were given. And so one of the things that they're doing alongside of creating these central bank digital currencies is, if you've noticed, they're trying to get rid of cash. So it used to be we had much larger denomination bills of cash than $100 bills. That's the largest we have in circulation today. But $100 doesn't purchase what it did 10 years ago, much less 50 or 100 years ago. And they're doing this all around the world. In Europe, if you spend more than €1,000 in cash, that's considered a criminal offense now. And wow. So even in Israel, they're implementing those types of things. And the idea behind it is, well, this targets criminals and money laundering organizations, but it pushes you into using the digital. And several banks in Australia have gone completely cashless. And so what happens when you're a business and your bank goes cashless? Well, if you accept cash from your customers, that means you're keeping all that cash around you, and thieves know that. So you're going to be compelled to go cashless yourself.
Hmm.
And if everywhere as a customer that you're doing business is cashless, your bank becomes cashless, then most people are going to simply say, well, I guess I have to go cashless, and they're going to go along with it. And those of us that hold out, well, we'll be forced to eventually because we'll be such a minority, similar to as we saw with COVID. The pressure will be applied. They start with this is all about incentives. They'll start with the carrot. Oh, go and do this, and you can get a free cheeseburger and fries, as the mayor of New York said. But if you don't do this, well, here's the things we're going to do to you. So all of that is coming with this as well. It's just a matter of time. But we need to, stand for righteousness and stand against these things the best we can.
Yes, we are here for such a time as this. Our great-great-grandparents never would have imagined, right? Of course, that was before the internet and everything else. That was BC, before COVID. Britt, Gillette, it went by fast, but man, fascinating topic. And again, we don't do this, friends and family in Christ, to scare you. We'd get nothing out of that. We're just trying to make you aware. And as you said in your video, prepare, do what you can just to be aware of what's happening, and don't put it past them because they're already lying and they will lie again. Your Substack, again, brittgillette.substack.com. That's new. Go to his YouTube channel. Brother, thanks. This was great. I appreciate it. Good having you on Worldview Matters.
Thanks. It was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Lord willing, we'll do it again. Yeah, friends, we have all kinds of different topics that we cover on this podcast. We're very fortunate to talk to what I consider experts, men and women of God, who have, some are specialized, some are just very, very biblically astute and can just prepare the body of Christ, because many of us in some churches have not been equipped by our pastors, so we need to share these types of shows. And again, not to scare you, but just say, hey, this is the world system. What would we expect the last days to look like, right? Well, thank you again for sharing the podcast. God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.